Thanks, Jana, and good morning, everybody. So as you can see, my name is Bart Eelen. I'm particularly happy to be here because although I'm in product communication in Toyota Europe now, until about 2 months ago, I was in vehicle planning, and the project that I was working on was Prius. And not only that, but when I started my career at Toyota, it was around the same time that the first generation Prius was launched. So you can say that hybrid and Prius has been sort of constant throughout my time with Toyota. At that time, when we did launch the first Prius, awareness of CO2 in Europe amongst the general public was still very limited. It would take another 6 years before an inconvenient truth came out. And even if the European Union had endorsed the Kyoto Protocol, it was a domain that was largely reserved for progressive politicians and academics. It was not something that the general public paid much attention to. So when the first Prius arrived to the market, and in a market that was dominated by manual diesel hatchbacks and manual diesel wagons, understandably, the audience didn't immediately embrace an automatic petrol hybrid sedan. But still, the car received a lot of praise from people in the know, and throughout the life cycle of the first generation, we managed to sell about 5,000 units across Europe, and I think similar to what happened here in the United States, mainly to tech-savvy people, to people who were really interested in the environment, and also early adopters. But then the wider scale traction for Prius and for hybrid technology really came with the second generation, not in the least because the car managed to get the European Car of the Year title when it came out. But also the environment was starting to change around this time. Some European governments had begun to put in place CO2-based taxation, which not only made hybrid much more interesting from a financial point of view for users, it also meant that the CO2 awareness was raised amongst the general public. And of course, as you already saw, the fact that many stars and role models were starting to use Prius to come to premieres and parties and whatnot, mainly here in the United States, also didn't go unnoticed in Europe. Since then, hybrid has really been going from strength to strength, and the success of the second generation and then the third generation of Prius gave us all the confidence we needed to try and move hybrid forward in another way and to bring it to our core model lineup in Europe, because we recognized it as a unique opportunity to differentiate ourselves from our European competitors and to offer something to the market that they couldn't. So we brought hybrid first to Auris and then to Yaris in Europe. These are cars that are produced in our factories in France and in the UK, and they compete in the heart of the European market in the so-called B and C segments. And they are our biggest sellers. To give you an idea, if you combine the sales of Yaris and Auris together, all models, all different engine types, they represent over half of our sales in Europe. When we started planning the hybrid versions of these vehicles, we set ourselves some ambitious targets. Our intention was to sell about 20% of Yaris as hybrid and even 30% of Auris. You have to know that in Europe, we tend to have quite a wide engine range available per model. So these were really ambitious targets. However, we were trumped by reality. If we look at what we are doing now in the first half of this year, we are selling close to 30% of hybrid on Yaris and close to 40% on Auris. This means that in our two most important models in Europe, Yaris has overtaken diesel in terms of importance. And in the case of Auris, it has even become the single best-selling engine in our lineup. For Lexus, if anything, hybrid has been even more defining. Just like here, we introduced the first hybrid Lexus around 2005, the RX 400h. And also there we recognized it as a way to position the brand really compared to the European premium brands with which we compete heavily. And as hybrid became available on more and more models in the Lexus lineup, we took the decision to move the Lexus brand in an almost entirely hybrid direction for Europe. And today, if you look at Lexus sales outside of Russia, 92% of all Lexuses sold in Europe are actually hybrids. That's today. We've just launched the IS300H in Europe, which is one of the biggest selling models. This means that next year will be the first full year of sales for the IS300H, which means that this 92% is likely to even increase in 2014. If we add the Toyota and Lexus sales since the original launch of Prius, we've sold over 600,000 units of hybrid in Europe. And what is also noteworthy is that the acceleration of the hybridization of our brand is exponential. In the first half of this year, we've increased hybrid sales by 70% compared to the same period of last year, thanks to the introduction of some new models. So what has been bringing around about this rapid change in Europe? Well, first of all, and as I mentioned before, something which was really important for us is the fact that several European governments are putting in place incentives which support the sales of hybrids. Most of those are based on CO2 performance. Some of those are based really on the technology itself, on hybrid technology. However, it's important to remember that Europe is not one market and that the situation is very different from one country to another. To give but one example, the country which is most advanced in terms of CO2-based taxation is the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, about 60% of our total vehicle mix now is hybrid for the Toyota brand. And in the case of Auris, for example, more than half of all the Aurises sold in Netherlands are hybrid. That being said, also in countries where there is no CO2-based taxation, hybrid is getting increasingly popular, mainly due to the fact that fuel prices are rising, and more and more people see the advantage of driving a hybrid vehicle also there from that point of view. Secondly, there's been the technological advance. If you compare the first generation Prius that we sold to the current generation, the hybrid system has become about 30% more powerful and about 25% more efficient. But also, over time, some of the downsides that were associated with hybrid have been resolved. For example, the Yaris and the Auris hybrid cars now have their hybrid battery under the rear seat, which means that there's no payoff anymore in terms of trunk capacity. The trunk capacity of these vehicles is the same as for the petrol and the diesel derivatives. Despite these improvements, and this is the third point, thanks to our long experience with hybrids, we were able to reduce the costs significantly. And this cost reduction has been instrumental in being able to bring hybrid technology also to the smaller and therefore the more price-sensitive segments, such as the Yaris. But not only did it do that, it also puts us in a position where we can fully push hybrid technology as a key pillar of our product offer and of our powertrain offer without having to worry about any influence that this might have on the total profitability of a vehicle line. And then the final point that I want to raise, a little bit perversely perhaps, is the fact that our competitors in Europe are now also slowly starting to introduce hybrid. And this is not only helping them, and it's not only helping the environment, but it's also helping us because, again, it's a way of increasing awareness for this technology. And we see that as customers start looking at a hybrid technology, they visit our competitor showroom, then they inevitably also end up at the Toyota showrooms. And more often than not, they finally select a Toyota. So in a market where more and more hybrids are on sale, we actually saw our share of the hybrid market in Europe increase from 59% last year to 75% this year for the first half year. So does this mean that we think that hybrid has come to the limits of its success? Well, definitely not. The preconditions in the market that make hybrid attractive are still changing in our favor. First and foremost, there are the ever more strict CO2 emissions norms that are set by the European Union. So the fleet average target for 2015 is set at 130 grams. And to achieve these targets, European governments will have to continue to put hybrid incentives in place, which will mean that the cost of ownership for a hybrid customer is going to continue to improve compared to traditional technologies. And then for 2020, we've got a further target of 95 grams per kilometer, which will mean that hybrid simply becomes indispensable for most brands in the European landscape. All the more so, and this is the next point, because it's not only CO2 that's being targeted. Under the Euro 6 banner, which comes into play next year, new norms are also set for other harmful emissions. Recently in Europe, there's been a lot of talk about air quality because more and more countries are starting to struggle to meet the air quality norms that have been set, especially in cities. And one of the main reasons for that is that in their attempt to improve CO2 emissions, governments have been strongly supporting, in one way or another, dieselization in Europe. And only now is happening in Europe what already happened quite a long time ago, I think, in the US. People are starting to see the flip side of that and are starting to understand the negative or the potential negative impact of diesel in terms of air quality, especially in urban areas. So therefore, what Euro 6 is trying to do is trying to rectify that situation by putting norms in place for nitrogen oxides and for hydrocarbons, specifically on diesel engines. Now, to meet these norms, in principle, it's not a problem because the technology exists today. So it's just a matter of installing it on the engine. But of course, it comes at a cost, which means that the cost of diesel engines will go up. The cost of diesel engine cars will go up, and especially in the smaller segments, which are price sensitive, this is going to become more of an issue as we go forward. And the good thing is, in the case of hybrid, we are already in a position that allows us to meet those norms without adding additional technology and therefore additional costs. So today, the cost of a hybrid powertrain is already largely on par with that of a diesel engine with similar output. And on top of that, you get the automatic transmission for free, if you like, on a hybrid. And due to the evolution of what I've just described, we will see that we will probably get into a situation where the cost of a hybrid will nestle neatly in between the cost of a petrol powertrain and the cost of a diesel powertrain, which will mean that it becomes more attractive to owners of current types of vehicles today. Then the final point that I want to raise, and which we expect to further enhance the adoption of hybrid, is the fact that the traffic conditions are changing in Europe. There's more and more traffic, of course, but also there is an expectation that the urbanization will continue to increase. There are UN figures out which predict that by 2030, 75% of all people in Europe will be living in cities or at least urbanized areas. The kind of traffic conditions that this causes, congested traffic, are actually the best conditions in which to enjoy a hybrid. And you mentioned earlier in one of the earlier presentations, or you raised the question, is there some kind of emotional benefit also from driving a hybrid? Yes, of course, there's the hybrid sporty side, which we might decide to develop in the future. But there's also the fact, and this is feedback that we're getting from an increasing number of customers, that driving a hybrid car is actually a very relaxing way to drive. And especially in city environments, it's a much easier way to drive than a diesel or a petrol car, for example. And what's more, due to this increase in urban traffic, we can see that slowly the balance is tipping, even in Europe, towards automatic transmissions. So in the past, we definitely were very much a manual transmission market, but year on year, the mix of automatics in the market is increasing. And for us, this is good news because we know that we are much more likely to conquest existing petrol and diesel automatic customers than to conquest from manual customers with hybrid. So all in all, this is why we think that going forward in our model mix in Europe, hybrid will continue to be a decisive factor and is going to continue to raise its mix. This doesn't mean that we think that petrol will die soon or that diesel will die soon. No, these are just technologies that are going to exist next to each other, and it's going to be up to the customer much more in future than it was in the past to make up for himself which is the most appropriate powertrain. And for manufacturers such as ourselves, I think one of the big tasks in the future will be to properly and honestly educate the customer about the advantages of each type of powertrain and to enable them to make the right choice. But one thing is for sure, hybrid is going to be the right choice for an increasing number of European customers. So thank you for listening to me. I'd like to hand over now to Keisuke, who will explain to you about the hybrid situation in the Japanese market. Thank you very much.